I just want to thank everyone for showing up. It's been a long time since we had Django Boston, and I had and still have a lot going on, dragging my feet. So I want to thank Ruben and Zags and John and Ari and Jackson and everyone who have been active in the community and doing things, whether on the Slack channel or communicating with me directly, but helping to kind of push forward and keeping the community going. So I want to thank you all, and I especially want to thank you, Ruben, for jumping in and co-organizing, because that really helps share it and move it forward. So with that, would like to introduce Zagorsky, who is going to give a talk on rapidly doing a project over a weekend. Would you like to try taking the screen there, Zags?
Sure. I did test this earlier, but there's it's not to say what works in the test works in production. Am I in full screen on the screen share?
Yep.
Okay. So hello everybody, and welcome to Django Boston, and also wherever else people happen to be, such as places as exotic as Cambridge or Minnesota. So as John gave away, I'm here to talk to you about rapid prototyping in Django, and I want to give this talk the subtitle: Building a Website in a Weekend and Not Regretting It Later. So just to give motivation of who I am, why I'm giving this talk. So I'm Zags. That's short for Benjamin, as you can see here. And I'm the CTO at Zagran. We're a contract software company based in Boston, although based in Boston means a lot less right now than it used to. I feel like my employees are ending up in amusing places like Cape Cod in California. And so we do full stack software development. We do a lot of work with Django. Just to give you the picture, we do web, mobile, third-party APIs, server management, the whole gambit. But Django's at the middle of it. And also just in the nature of doing contract work, we do a lot of rapid prototypes. There's a lot of projects where we need to come in and get something that works initially, whether that's for a new project or a rebuild. And then we end up working off that. A lot of times we end up working off of the prototypes we built for years, 5 or 6 in some cases. So not only have we done a lot of rapid prototyping, but we've also lived with the consequences of the prototypes we've built. So what I want to do is give you some of some of our tips and tricks for how to do the prototyping well, but also not have things you do in getting that initial prototype up burn you later. So that's why I'm giving this talk. Now the question is, why are you listening to this talk? And the motivation that I want to give you is that time is limited, and rapid prototyping is not just necessarily a thing for you to use for some cool idea that you've got that you want to use to do a hackathon on, but it's really actually a method that you should bring to all of your Django projects, or all of your software projects in general. Django's just one tool, and I'm going to show you how to do it well in Django. But this is generally an approach that I think software should use in general. For you in particular, I mean, you've got lots of ideas. Not all of them will work. That might not be true. If you are the person in the audience and all of your ideas do work, please send me an email. I want to meet you. Get to know more about that. But for everybody else, not all of your ideas will work, and all of your ideas will take attention, time, effort, all of that away from known ways you have of making money. That's either you have an established business and that's working well, or you have a day job. You're thinking of starting a company, you've got an idea you want to try out, but you do or could have a day job. As software engineers, your time is valuable. This is a valuable commodity. So let's think of you gotta be conservative with that. And so what that means is you want to take the lean startup approach and build an MVP as fast as possible. The reason why is because if your idea fails, you want to find out as cheaply as possible. And honestly, if it succeeds, you want to find that out as cheaply as possible too. Why not? Get there faster. But if it succeeds, and this is something that people tend to skip in the lean startup approach, you also want to make sure that you're not going to regret some of the corners that you cut earlier. Your prototype is going to be the foundation, if this product works, for that product. And so so it is back to the tagline. The goal here is to build a website in a weekend, but not regret it later. So the 4 things I'm going to run through is things, and this one might surprise you, actually things to do before you start coding. I am actually going to talk about some of that. Then key tools. These are things to let you build faster, really get that code out the door. Corners to cut. This is ways to things you don't necessarily have to build at first. And regrets to avoid. These are things that you might be tempted to skip that you really shouldn't. So let's dive into it. Before you start, there's a radical concept. Know what you're going to build ahead of time. I feel like there's this prevailing myth. There's this runs around with lots of potential products or companies where there's this myth that somebody woke up on a Saturday morning with this idea. They coded furiously for 2 days, and then Sunday night they released it to the world, and everything changed. Most of the time, that's not how things work. Most of the time, there's actually a lot of prep work that goes into doing that on the ideation front, on the advanced design, things like that. And if you actually are going to, attempt to build a product real fast, there are a lot of things you can do before you actually start. Number 1, market research. There are a lot of things that have been built already, especially things that are, simple enough that you can build them, in a weekend or a week. And the question you should ask is your idea something that exists already? Or if there's something that exists that's similar, is your idea sufficiently different and different in ways users care about? Blackle is a real website. You can go to blackle.com, and it is Google with a black background for the search box instead of a white background. So is it different? Yes. Is it different in a way users care about? I'll leave that up to you. Another thing to think about is that the M in MVP stands for minimal. And a lot of people pay lip service to MVPs, but then end up shoving a whole bunch of features or extraneous things into that initial release. I actually want to put so much pressure on MVP to actually make you consider the form factor. Before you build a website, consider, can your idea actually be tested as a script? There's a personal project that was actually the motivation for this talk, and all of my examples are built around this. I built a task management system for myself to handle scheduled and recurring tasks. And while I did end up doing a weekend hackathon to build that, before I built the website, I actually built it as a script and ran it just as a script on a personal server with a cron job. The script took me 2 or 3 hours to write, because with a website, you need a database, you need proper servers and hosting and a domain name and all that stuff. Scripts are simpler. If you can test your idea as a script, start with that. Similarly, if you've got an idea for a mobile app, try it as a website first, as a mobile-friendly website. Apps take a lot more work to get up and running, and a lot of the tools that Django can give you that I'm going to show you won't work for mobile apps. Just another example on that front. I had a project in college. This was a weekend hackathon idea that I worked on, and I decided to build a web and mobile version. The web version took me 3 hours. The mobile version took me the rest of the weekend. So form factor matters. And even if you have a form factor that you need to use, don't just think about getting rid of extraneous features, but think about, is there some aspect of this you can build that will test that idea and provide value without all the rest of it? That's really the core behind MVP. The other thing to do before you start building is map out your product. Figure out the details of what you are building now and what you're not building now, but you want to build soon. Those affect the design. One of the big ways to not regret your prototype later is to actually have at least some of the rest of the product mapped out, so that you can take that into account when you're doing details of your prototype, when you're picking some of these foundational technologies, when you're designing your initial data model. Also, doing things like designing your user flows, picking technologies ahead of time, and planning your database structure can save you a lot of frustration, even in the prototype phase itself. One of the things I like to say is that interface follows from database. If you're working off of the wrong data structure, it's going to take you 2, 3 times as long to build whatever you're building, because you're going to be trying to hammer an interface into a data structure that's not compatible with it. So planning this stuff ahead of time can really save you tons of time when you're doing the actual build. I'm actually going to give you an example. So this is loosely based on my actual project. Here's a task list. So this is for the recurring task system and scheduled task system I built. Here's some things that you want to build. So let's say log in with Google, who wants to be bothered with having accounts. Users have a to-do list that they can view and edit, and then users can schedule one-time tasks for the future, recurring tasks that show up on a periodic schedule, and they can view and edit those schedules. So here we have a task list, and then we also have a backlog. Note the separation. These are nice to have features. These are not going to be part of the initial build, really putting that pressure on the MVP. But we also want to look at these to see how they impact our design. So let's say this was not where I ended up going, but let's say the direction we want to go with the backlog is we want to have this really be something that's useful for like teams and at kind of an enterprise level. So we might want to implement login with Okta and LinkedIn. If that's on the backlog, we might want to think about using some authentication aggregator, either a library or something like Auth0, instead of just plugging in some library that's dedicated for Google for logins. If you want users in the future at some point to be able to see tasks they finished, think about using soft deletions. That's using a deleted flag rather than doing an actual delete in the database. Because if you delete stuff in the database and later want users to be able to see that, well, you've already deleted it. Users will only be able to see stuff that they've deleted since you rolled out that feature. If you want users to be able to share tasks with each other, this might affect how you structure the relationships between users and each other, or users and ownership of tasks, things like that. So these are just examples of things you may want to build, and just how it impacts the design of the initial product. But also, not having these in the initial build makes this something that's buildable in a weekend. Mapping out your database. Here's just a sample database diagram. This is something that actually we use on all of our projects, not just our prototypes. This is what's known as a crow's foot diagram, because this allegedly looks like a crow's foot. I haven't studied crow's feet that closely in reality, but I'll trust whoever named it. And this is just mapping out the relationship of your models to each other. So for example, an organization can have many members. That makes sense. And each one of these is going to correspond to a foreign key in Django. The foreign key would go from membership to organization in this case. And mapping this out can help you vet your data model. You can think about it in the context of what users are going to be doing on this, and hopefully save yourself, several hours of building something down the wrong direction off of a data model you're going to change. Okay. That's all the boring, that sounds like biz dev stuff. Let's get into the meat of it, right? We're here to talk about code. Okay, let's talk about coding. So this is the section on key tools, and here's where I'm going to say something shocking. Don't write code. Okay, sorry, this is the Django meetup. Okay, don't write more code than you have to. For the initial build in particular, you want to focus on building the things that matter for your product. You've got a particular piece of business value you're trying to deliver, or personal value. I mean, this is a personal website. And you want to focus your development effort on delivering that value. Everything else that's extraneous to that, you should write as little code as possible for that. What you want to do is pull in libraries that will take care of that for you, get rid of the boilerplate, because that's not what you're innovating on. That's not what's different about your product. So don't start with that. Start with building what matters for your product. And the theme behind these key tools is going to be enabling you to do that. The number one biggest tool that if you walk away from this talk knowing about one tool, it's this guy, Django model forms. So taking a step back and talking about Django forms for a second before we actually get into model forms. Django forms are it's a feature in Django that I honestly regret not diving into deeper in my first few years of Django. Django forms are ways you can build a class that represents an HTML form, and then Django will take that class and do the work of rendering that HTML form on the front end, handling parsing post parameters, and handling form validation for you. Django model forms take that one step further, and they automatically generate your form from your data model. And then they actually take it another step further, and they implement a save method for you as well that will take what the user's done on that form and save that to the database, either creating or updating a model. So here's an example. This is, unless there's bugs in my PowerPoint, which it is very hard to get, actually well-formatted code into PowerPoint. I'm trying some new tools out today. Sorry if there are bugs if you're actually trying to use these slides as a reference. But and the slides will be posted after the talk, so don't worry about taking furious notes here. Also, the talk's recorded, so no worries on that front. So this is an actual model form. What we have is a model task. We say these are the fields that I want to be part of my form, and Django will automatically fill out form fields, will automatically construct a form with fields based on the types of these guys and the attributes you define on your data model. So for example, name is a char field with 256, 56 character limit. Django will automatically turn that into, a text input in your form with a 256 character limit. Due date's a date, it'll turn that into a date input, etc. Django forms also ship with a save method. Just in this example, I decided to override the save method to throw in one more parameter just to show you how to do that. But now this is not very much code right here in the model form, and yet this little piece of code gives you enormous leverage. So here is what a typical view would look like without a model form to create a task. Right, we got to parse the post parameters. We got to run some validation. We got to check if these are passed in. This isn't even doing all of the validation, by the way. We're not even checking length limit on name or whether or not this is a valid date, things like that. And then at the end of this, we create a task. Instead of this, that model form that I showed you on the previous slide turns it into this guy. Django Forms handles parsing the post parameters, doing the validation, creating the database object. And then on top of that, Django Forms is also going to pass validation errors as well as like the parameters the user entered back to the front end so that, if the user has validation errors, they don't have to retype everything they filled out and they get the validation errors inline in the form. That in and of itself should be justification for you to use Django Forms just like everywhere, not just for your rapid prototypes, but there's more. You also get savings on the front end. Seriously, Django Forms, they're amazing. So normally on your front end, you'd have to specify, on your form, you do the labels, inputs. This is just a 2-field form so far. And with Django Forms, instead of all this, boom, form as P. I mean, that just takes the fields on your form and renders them in HTML as paragraph elements. So this is an awesome tool. The drawback to Django Forms is that it makes it harder to style your form. This right here is just going to be dumping your form in plain HTML, no CSS classes attached to it. Doesn't look great. So we want to probably take it one step better. That's where Django Crispy Forms comes in. So this is a Django Crispy Forms third-party library. This setting is the most important one. If you bust out Crispy template pack, I mean, Bootstrap is just what I'm going to be using in this example, but you can give the template pack, say Bootstrap 4, and then you use the Crispy tag to render your form instead of Django's form, and then it renders with Bootstrap tags. It's not something to write home about how gorgeous it looks, but at least it's not going to be, plain HTML. Your users aren't going to, have a migraine when they open the page because they see, unformatted HTML inputs. Django Crispy Forms also handles, I think, some of the other blind spots that Django Forms has. In particular, you can add to your forms a form helper that does stuff that you can specify things like the form action on the form helper. You can add elements like submit buttons, and you can also do formatting of your elements, of your form inputs. You can add CSS classes, you can add form groups, things like that, all just as part of the form class. And the end result, this should be is revolutionary. This guy is what your template looks like. And this is what I'm talking about when I say don't write code. Generating forms, that stuff is all boilerplate. That's an awesome template. Because at this point, we're now automatically generating a front end that lets somebody go create a task from the model. And so the work that we did to make that model was in planning out that database model. A lot of that can be pre-work. Then you specify the model, you build a form, and Django takes care of it for you. So this is like the pinnacle of getting rid of boilerplate code. I absolutely love it. And also, Django Forms, I will just call out, are classes. And so if you've got shared logic, you can pull out that object-oriented programming you haven't used since college and do some class inheritance and, go hog wild. Speaking of inheritance, Django templates also have inheritance. So, and you absolutely should use it if you're using Django for templating. Django, you can make a base template, you can have other templates extend that and fill in. You can say, here's specific blocks that I want my other pages to fill in. And then your base template can have all of your CSS. You can have all of, your header with the top bar that shows up on all your pages, your footer that, talks about how awesome you are and then gives out your email address to anyone who goes to your website. Django templates and using template inheritance is great for two reasons. First, it means that it's faster for you to make new pages because you don't have to implement all of this stuff and copy paste that on each one of your pages. Your page can just have this stuff and this stuff. All it has to have is this stuff. So you can just make new pages real fast. And then also, when you want to make site-wide changes, it's really easy. If you want to add a new link in the top bar, you just stick that in one place in the base template. This is one of those things that's great because it both gets you going faster and also reduces regrets later. If you're using a base template, which you should be, you can also get a lot of mileage out of Django's messages framework. So Django messages, a lot of times you're going to be in a situation where what you want to do is take something is somewhere deep in your back end, or not so deep, surface to the user, basically on the next page, an alert, an error, a message of some kind. Django messages this is built into Django. It's a great way to do that. All you got to do is stick this lovely snippet or something that looks vaguely like it on your base template to take all of the messages that you've accumulated from your backend and load them on the page. By putting this in your base template, that means that Django messages will be loaded in any page that the user happens to visit. This is just a nice little setting snippet to have Bootstrap do styling on the messages. So you have Bootstrap colors that correspond to various message levels. And then to use it, so this is just setup you have to do in your base template and settings. Using it, super simple. You just throw messages.success or messages.error, and you can just chuck that around. And then, in terms of surfacing error messages or things like that to the user, that's no longer something you have to think about. This is just infrastructure Django's got that you can leverage. Switching gears for a little bit away from kind of front end and templating, let's talk about settings. So I would say Django has a lovely settings framework, but there are two problems with it. The first is that there are frequently settings that you want to have different in different environments. So you want to have debug on locally and not on production, for example. And there's also settings that contain potentially sensitive data, like your secret key or your database password. This is a problem that happens on basically every project, and Django Environment is a great solution to this. Django Environment will go look for settings for an environment file. It's a file called .env that lives in whatever directory your settings file happens to live in. If it doesn't find that, it will go look at your environment variables. And so this way you can have a configuration file for settings locally. You can use environment variables on servers, like things like Elastic Beanstalk and Heroku, that make it easy to configure environment variables for a particular server environment. And it switches seamlessly between them. And Django Environment will also do type coercion of anything that you give it a particular type. So for example, in this example, let's just take 3 common settings. You've got debug. This is going to be a Boolean. It's going to be false by default. So if it's not provided, Django Environment will just default that to false. Your secret key and database configuration are things that need to be provided for this to be valid. If they aren't, this will raise an invalid configuration error, which makes sense. And so then all 3 of these settings can be configured to be different for different environments, and then you're not checking your secret key into Git or your database password. And to use it, you just make a .env file with these things locally. You want to put that in your git ignore so that doesn't end up on your server by accident. And then just a nice thing to do for yourself or other people that end up working on this project is to make a .env example file that describes the structure of your env file so that if you lose yours or somebody else is starting to work on the project, they know what you're supposed to fill out in this. This is how you specify this locally. On the server, you could either use a .env file if that works with whatever server technology you're doing, or you could specify these as environment parameters. And Django will go do the type coercion on anything you specify. This is a great tool, not just for prototypes and getting off the ground, but also for for real projects, but for mature projects. Prototypes are real too. Another great tool that is, all these things are things that I love using in proper projects, but are also just great for getting things off the ground. Django storages. You do not want to store files on your servers. Servers are ephemeral. Doesn't matter how many years that particular server's been running, it'll die someday. And you don't want to lose all those files on it when it does. Django storage is a great solution for this. It's a third-party library. All you've got to do is plug in something along the lines of these 5 settings in your Django settings. Tell it to use, let's say this is for S3, for example, if you want to store your files there. You give it your AWS keys using conveniently Django environment. It builds on itself. You give it a bucket. You say, please make my files private. And then anything that you save to a Django file field on one of your models will get saved to Django, to wherever you specify here. And so just seamlessly, you don't have to go read, the Bodo 3 docs or figure out how to integrate with S3. You just do this, start saving things to file fields, and they get put on S3 for you, which is really great. And just added bonus here, just in this little code snippet, if you do something like that, you can actually do conditionals in your Django settings. So if you do something like if not debug, this will only happen on production, and locally you can still use Django's local file storage for your local computer, so you don't need to set up like S3 for doing local development, and it'll just switch seamlessly between those if you do something like this. The one taking the cake for worst named library in here is Social Auth App Django. It used to be called Django Social, and then it got merged into the Python Social project as the Django specific piece of that, and ended up with this name. Sorry about that. This is great for doing OAuth logins. So if, for example, you want to do login with Google, you pull this guy out. This does look like a pretty intimidating pile of settings, but this is really just, this is pretty much all the settings you need to configure. These guys, you need to go over to Google and configure an OAuth client. And then to use it, you just stick a link like this on your page to log in with Google, and Social Auth App Django, Social Django, takes care of the rest for you. This is great for just getting login up really fast. You don't have to go configure, password reset workflows or things like that if people are logging in with Google. The last great tool that I want to pull out, this isn't one that necessarily saves you code as much as debugging aggravation, is Django extensions. So this is a library, you stick it in your installed apps, and it gives you 2 really awesome management commands, shell plus and run server plus, that are drop-in replacements for manage.py shell and run server. Shell plus, when you run it, automatically loads all your database models, which just over the life of a project might save you hours in typing import statements. So that's amazing. You can also even configure it to add your own imports at shell startup, which is great. And Run Server Plus, when you hit that 500 page on the debug 500 page in particular, the one that shows you your stack trace, it gives you an interactive terminal that you can hit on any line of that stack trace and interact with the variables that were in scope at that moment in time. So rather than having to go run through a ton of print statements, you can just debug it right there. So really great tool. And that's just on the debug 500 page. That doesn't happen on your production 500 page. So that's how to build the code that you were planning to build faster. This is what code you should skimp on, keeping in mind you're aiming for good enough. Now, this section is a section I have to give 2 caveats. First, we're talking about building a prototype here. So these are not necessarily recommendations for a fully fledged production system. These are recommendations for how to get up and running fast. Some of them you can still use on a production system, but I just want to put that caveat out there. And the other is not all of these may work for your project. What corners you can cut do depend on the project. So if your project needs a particular thing, you may have to actually you may have to be required to use that particular corner for that project. So first of all, minimal CSS. Again, the goal here is good enough. What you really want to do is use Bootstrap or some other framework that's not Bootstrap. I know some people think Bootstrap looks passé, and just do generic customizations that'll work across all your pages. Unless styling is a really important piece of the prototype, let's keep it minimal. You can bring in fancier styling later. And more importantly, the less CSS that you've put in the first place, and the easier it's going to be to restyle. Same thing with JavaScript. I mean, just working off of the examples that I've shown, if you don't need front-end dynamism, Django forms, Django templates can do pretty much all of your front-end for you. It's not necessarily going to be as snappy, or it's as a single-page JavaScript app could be, but it's going to be a lot faster in terms of development time. Now, caveat here, like if you don't need front-end dynamism, if you're building, for example, as your app 2048, that's all front-end JavaScript. You can't cut this particular corner in some cases, so just be aware of that. The other thing is that the goal here is to auto-generate the front end. So if we're replacing this with a single-page JavaScript app later, there's not really that much work that we're throwing out here. So it's not necessarily it's not that we're investing a ton in the wrong direction. Also, Django Forms and Django REST framework have a pretty similar interface. So swapping from one to the other, it's actually less work than you would think. Don't worry about pre-launch migration. Let me just say up front, I love Django migrations. They're an incredible tool, one of Django's best features, but Django migrations are really about managing a production database against changes in your database schema. Before you launch, you don't have a production database. So don't waste time making migrations, maintaining compatibility between different schema versions. Just if you're making a big change to your models, delete your local database, wipe your migrations, keep going. And also, I highly recommend deleting and remaking migrations before your initial launch so that you don't have all of the schema changes you made during initial development as baggage in your code base forever. Once you're live, do migrations, be diligent about that. They're a great tool. In terms of other things that really matter for live, I mean, things that matter later, but aren't necessarily things you care about initially, is permissioning. I'm not saying skip authentication. Django's got some really great and easy to use authentication decorators. This is permissioning. This is, pulling out a fully fledged permissions framework like Django Guardian or things like that. There are frameworks out there that are really great, but you're probably not going to get your permissioning model right in the first place. So it's not worth investing a ton of effort into setting up a theoretically pure permissions framework to manage it. I think really what you want to do in the beginning is do something very simple, something like a class method that you just call, it's a one line to call this at the start of each view, check that users have access to various objects, and come back and replace this later. Once you actually know more about how your users are related to each other and your core objects and can actually properly design a permission system. The Django admin, if you haven't used it, is a really great way to just put a GUI on top of your database, especially for semi-technical users or technical users that don't want to be bothered to SSH in. I don't know if this is a plus side or a downside. It's reminiscent of PHP MyAdmin for those old school folks who used that back in the day. If you've got features, if you've got needs for various internal trusted users to be able to just do things across the site, you might want to consider using the Django admin just as an initial stopgap, and they can go in and just basically edit the database fields through a GUI rather than you needing to build dedicated features to handle that. It's really fast to set up. You can do some basic customizations very easily. Two caveats I want to throw out here. This is not great for non-technical users. It can give them too much access if you don't configure it right, and they may end up changing a database field that you assumed would not get changed in that way. And you will also outgrow it. I mean, if you have a robust set of admin functionality that you need to build out, you're going to get beyond what the customizations can do. But we're talking about cutting corners and getting a prototype up fast. This is one that can get you actually a pretty advanced feature set pretty easily, and then you haven't invested all that much effort if you want to replace it later. Using SQLite locally, this is a corner this is actually something that you can do even on a mature Django project if you know how to manage it right. I love this particular shortcut because I hate installing Postgres. And if you haven't installed Postgres, go try it sometime and you'll understand why. So SQLite is not is not a robust database management system. It mimics the interface of SQL, but stores your database in a single file rather than you having a daemon process running that has its own set of files that it manages, which is great for local development because you don't have to install Postgres. You don't have to make sure there's a daemon running. Backing up and restoring and deleting your database is so easy because there's just a file right there. You delete or rename the file, and you've deleted or renamed your data or backed up your database. Caveats here: SQLite doesn't enforce limits on character fields. It doesn't have an identical schema change behavior to Postgres. So this is really good for doing your initial prototype, but when you are actually live, and you are going to be, if you are still using SQLite, you really need to test, especially your migrations, on a staging environment that is using the same database technology as production. And also, just to call this out, SQLite isn't compatible with Postgres-specific features like JSON fields, at least not without a substantial amount of shims. This is something that you can use to get a lot of mileage out of Django. Get started really fast locally. But you should, at least when you start getting into production for real, at least test your migrations and your functionality on Postgres if you are going to continue using SQLite locally, kind of post go live. So those are corners that are good to cut. Now let's talk about corners that are bad to cut, and then after that I'll open it up to the floor. My first recommendation here is that you should use a platform as a service as opposed to infrastructure as a service. These are really wacky acronyms, so let me say that in English. You want to use something like Elastic Beanstalk, Heroku, or Google App Engine rather than just launching a server yourself and configuring Apache and doing all that, or Nginx if you're an Nginx person. And similarly, you really want to use a managed database system like RDS, Heroku, or Cloud SQL rather than installing Postgres yourself on a server. And I mentioned this earlier, you definitely do not want to store files on your server. You want to use block storage like S3 or Google Cloud Storage. The reasons for this are, the big reasons for this are like automatic backups and failover. It's hard to argue with that. Checkbox encryption. You really don't want to be maintaining your own encryption. What's worse than losing your database is losing the encryption key to your database, and so you have all your data but can't access it, and it's just don't want to be in that situation. And easy to scale. If you start getting a lot of traction on your system, you can just flip a switch, get another server, or increase the size of your server. The reason that I put this in this section is there's two reasons. One is if this site works, well, three. So first, if this site works, you really do not want to have a catastrophic failure that loses you all of your traction. So, having a site and it's really great and 2 months in you lose all your users' data, you potentially just alienated your entire user base. Additionally, scaling, that really matters if this is going to succeed. If your site is succeeding, you've got a ton of users, you're going to be inundated in lots of stuff, feature requests, all that stuff. You're not going to have time to go redo all of your infrastructure. And finally, having to shift from some homegrown server that you set up yourself to a proper managed hosting is not always straightforward. Being on one of these from the beginning can help prevent you from taking shortcuts like storing files directly on the server or things like that. So this is one that I really would recommend from the beginning. This is one that actually Django recommends from the beginning. So I'm just gonna piggyback right on that. Override Django's user model, even if you aren't planning to change it. Like even if there's no fields that you want different from Django's base user model, you should still override it. This is how you do it, real simple. You could also put your own fields where it says pass or extra fields you want to add. The reason for that is it's very hard to change the user model mid-project. I actually did it recently on a project, and it's a harrowing experience. I do not recommend it. It is possible. I have done it to change the user model mid-project to a custom model, but have this from the beginning, and you don't have to worry about that, and you can add custom fields later. And just to encourage you to actually do that because you want custom fields on your user model, I would also recommend having a base database model from the start. the main reason, there's two fields that I love to just have on every model from the get-go in a project, created on and updated on. It just helps with doing a lot of digging into, you know, if something goes wrong, or if you want to go analyze historic, you know, behavior, things like that. This is just great data to collect from the start. If you don't have these fields from the start, you don't have that data from the start. This is a little more controversial. So this change is not necessarily for everybody, but you can actually change all of your database objects to use a UUID primary key instead of an auto incrementing ID. This can be great if you're planning to just expose data to a ton of external systems via an API. There is like an ongoing debate, however, as to whether or not the performance hit of like using a UUID is, you know, actually sizable. And I will say that this is slightly obnoxious for debugging, because instead of just being able to type, you know, 16 into your terminal when you're looking up an object, you got to paste a whole UUID. So up to you if you want to use this one, but just having a base model, definitely these two fields, highly recommend it. Database constraints. These are things that are much easier to take away than to add. So you really want to err on the side of too restrictive rather than too permissive when you're designing your database model. For example, you really want to have null false by default, and that actually is the Django default on a field. You should really only be putting null true on fields that actually can be nullable, because if a field ends up being nullable later, it's very easy to take null off. It's much harder to allow null. It's much harder to remove nullable from a field, because then you have to go reconcile all the things that have null there. Django now actually requires you to set a deletion behavior on foreign keys, and I highly recommend setting it to protect. Django used to default to cascade, and that's not a great default, which is why they took that away in, I think, Django 2. Cascading deletes can, if you don't manage them properly, can have unexpected behavior, like data you didn't expect to delete gets deleted. So setting your foreign keys to protect, that is, you know, a really good default to have, unless you explicitly want that cascading delete. Just last piece of advice on this one, adding joint unique constraints of wherever relevant. Django exposes a SQL feature where you can say every entry in a particular table should be unique on a pair or a triplet of columns. And having that in from the beginning, you know, it might seem obnoxious that a user gets an error instead of it just working, but it's actually much better for that to error and you to find out about it early than for you to be cluttering your database with garbage data that you're going to have to reconcile months later. This is a thing that you're probably going to have to do if you're using platform as a service, but having a requirements file, requirements.txt from the beginning, that documents the Python libraries your project is using, is really important. It takes an obnoxious amount of forensics work to create a requirements.txt file for a project if it doesn't have one from the beginning. Have one of these from the beginning. Every time you add a library to your project, put it in this file. Pip tools is also a great library to just help make your requirements text file better. Instead, you write a requirements.in file, run pip compile, and it goes and takes all of the libraries you specified and finds the latest compatible version off of PyPy and generates your requirements.txt file for you from this guy. But just have one of these from the start. You really don't want to get burned having to reconstruct it later. Error handling, honestly, is so easy these days. You would be, you know, you're living dangerously by not having it. Sentry, I would argue, is more complex to set up an account than it is to integrate with your project. Here's all you need to do to integrate it with your project. Stick this in your settings file. There's lots of alternatives to Sentry. This is just one example that we use a lot. And error handling, you want to get proactively notified about errors. You don't want to have to build, you know, error reporting and have users emailing you with, you know, and have to go dig through logs and not have, you know, stack traces to reconstruct from. So this is just having this from the beginning also really helpful. Security, I gave a talk on this last year that was much longer than one slide. So this is just my top 5 punch list. SSL from the start, no excuses. You might have had an excuse 10 years ago, but you can now get free SSL certificates using Let's Encrypt. If you're on Amazon, Amazon Certificate Manager also has free auto-renewing certificates that you can plug into a load balancer. There's lots of options for this. Django CSRF, you should make sure it's enabled, and don't modify data through GET requests because that bypasses it. Don't use raw SQL. It's bad for maintainability. It's dangerous for security. You want your servers and database to automatically install updates. Equifax, excuse me. This is really easy to do if you're using, platform as a service like Elastic Beanstalk. You can just say install updates every, Monday at 4 a.m. And probably encrypt your database and file storage. Again, with managed hosting, it's just a checkbox. Why wouldn't you check it? Why get into trouble? So all of that is how you build a website in a weekend. If you've completed your hackathon, the question is what next? Aside from launching it. So this is just this is some my fairly generic advice, but test it on real users. Have objective metrics for success and failure, because your subjective metric says it's great because you built it. So of course it's great. I recommend building the features that your users want rather than the ones you want, unless you're the user, in which case do whatever you want. If your data model is wrong, change it early. Interface follows from database. You don't want to be running around with a bad data model. Just the earlier you change it, the easier everything will be. And finally, if your website is succeeding, if it's getting a lot of use or traction, that's the point at which you can put back the corners that you cut. So that's what I've got for you today. This is my email. Feel free to, I think the slides will be posted, but feel free to email me if you have specific questions. We're also going to open it up for questions. And also email me if you need contract software work and you want somebody else to build your rapid prototype for you. All right, over to you guys.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the great talk. Looks like we have some questions, and I'll hand it off to John to handle the questions.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, guys. So we have first questions from Zilberenga. One, can you, do you want me to ask the questions for you? Do you want to ask your questions?
Yeah, so I can definitely ask. Yeah, so my name is Ezra, and well, I had two questions. One of them is regarding the forms, if there's a way to use them easily with a web framework like React or Vue. And the second one on the same subject on the forms is, I saw someone posted a link, but the maintenance of crispy forms. And in general, you say use packages, whereas it can be pretty dangerous in terms of if you don't select the right package that's not maintained.
So Django Crispy Forms, I think, is a pretty strong following. In terms of, that is a risk with just kind of anything open source, but on the flip side, these things are all open source, and you can theoretically go make a fork yourself. I think the other thing in terms of crispy forms in particular, if you're using it just to get up and running, you're not necessarily using it for that much. There are a couple of different packages that you can use to just do bootstrap formatting of a Django form that work pretty well. In terms of React and Vue, more on that side, if you really want to use those in your prototype, and keep in mind, that is not something you can take for granted. Django REST framework does have a lot of similar abilities to Django forms, where you can generate serializers just automatically based on just from your models. So model serializers, that's a really good thing to look at in Django REST framework. And then beyond that is kind of up to React and Vue to give you leverage in terms of how to get your actual front end and implementation up fast. That's One other thing that I want to call out, and this is a trick that we've used on a number of prototypes, if there's a particular spot that you're going to need a lot of front end magic, you can pull out React or Vue on that page or that particular set of pages. The rest of it can all just be automatically generated Django front end, and then you can as the life of the project goes on, expand old pages into that single page front end app.
All right. Thanks, Zags. Thanks, Silverina. I guess next, John Kaparsky.
Yeah. So you talked about using the Django admin as a cheat, as a shortcut to getting stuff up and running, and I could see the why that's tempting. I work on a piece of software that took that approach 5 years ago, and we have still not been able to completely eliminate this. In fact, getting our staff off of the Django admin has been a number 3 on our roadmap for the past 3 years running, and has not yet happened. Can you talk a little bit about the problems of establishing that pattern and good ways to get out of that pattern?
Sure. So I would say, I think probably the most dangerous aspect of the Django admin is that you can customize it. And there's a temptation to build, like initially the thing that you need is, you've got this quick thing. It's like, all right, well, we need, I don't know, let's say admins need to be able to reset passwords on users' behalf, or admins need to be able to go, something of that ilk. You throw up the Django admin, that gets done. And then somebody says, oh, also we want this thing where an admin can go, do this complex action. And you're like, okay, well, let's shoehorn that into the Django admin. And I feel like that's the point at which you've lost the war. At the point at which you start doing things where it's complex functionality where basically you've built like back-end logic that you then plug into the Django admin. That's really where I think you hit the point of no return. As long as all you're doing with the Django admin is just customizing like the table layouts and like what fields are editable and not, like that's pretty safe in terms of like establishing expectations of user behavior. One other thing that I want to call out is that I guess two suggestions on that front. One is you've got users that have staff or super user status. If you're using the Django admin, you can build a set of pages that leverages that same permission check. So this is actually a thing that we did on a project recently where we're trying to get out of the Django admin pretty early because the users already need functionality that's beyond what it can do. And so we just started building them a set of pages that we just started building functionality conditional around them having the staff role. And it's just on the main page when we're talking about permissioning checks. So here's kind of the other trick. We just built into the permissioning system, if a user has a staff role, they have permission to do anything. And so they can just go use all the regular pages as if, but they have permission to do like anything. They have permission to kind of access any object, but through the regular workflows. And so that way they can, they can do anything that a user could do. And then we can also have a set of dedicated admin pages, for them that also check for that staff role, just as a way of kind of easing them out of the admin.
Interesting.
But like the situation you really don't want to end up in, and this is actually, I've been there, trying to optimize the like Django database performance in the admin of like loading a related model in line into like the view of a particular model. Like when you're there, stop trying to do that. It is going to be easier to just build that feature out of the admin than it's going to be to build it in.
I can guarantee you that the Django admin, while it's really nice as a prototyping tool, does not in any way scale to be usable when you've got a database that's growing.
Totally.
So if you're tempted to use the Django admin as a stopgap to get the prototype, be aware that you have to get out of it within the first year.
Yeah, and that is why I put the one of my caveats was like this you're gonna run out of rope on the customizations pretty quick. I think really, as long as you can, like, using the Django admin just as like an interface on top of the database, that's fine. And at the point at which you want to do anything fancier, you should build dedicated pages yourself.
Awesome, thanks guys. There is a question on from B. Bierce, I think, on debugging.
Yeah, some people already tried to sort of answer it with this aliases comment. But anyway, so I have like a Docker Compose situation with like Postgres in a container, Nginx in a container, Django is one of the containers. And so, I monitor things with the general logs or container specific logs just to see what's going on as everything's just logging. And sometimes I want to drop like a pdb.setTrace in the middle of some Django code, maybe model or view, and it just blows right past it in the logs when I do the action that would trigger it. Like I see the prompt, the little pdb prompt, but it's like I can't interact with it. And somebody's saying use aliases, use a Docker run versus a Docker compose up command or Docker compose run, and something about using aliases to be able to do that. But you were mentioning these special debuggers, and how would you tackle that, I guess?
Sure. Well, all right. So let me preface this with, I've got 99 problems, and then I use Docker, and now I have a lot more. The Docker Docker is a really convenient technology for infrastructure management, and I have found that it makes debugging a lot harder.
Totally.
Let me try and tackle this on both the local side and the server side, because the approach is different. On the local side, tools like Django extensions. I mean, what Django extensions does is, it injects a terminal into the browser front end so you get access straight through the browser to like an interactive terminal when you've got debug mode on. That's probably going to be your best bet for local development. And if you want to hit, basically an interactive terminal, the best thing to do at that point is raise an exception. You can then just get that interactive. You can get that interactive terminal in the browser using Django extensions, and then interact with whatever you're going to be able to do. It's not truly a breakpoint because your page is crashed at that point.
But you have access to all the variables, and it is an interactive terminal, even though it's in the browser, and it's a Python one, right? Just
Yep, it is.
All right. You were going to say something else, I think.
Sure. I was just going to say on the server side, I would be scared to try and leverage any like interactive terminal on the server, but a good error handling framework like Sentry will not just capture the stack trace, but a lot of other context, like the local variables that are at each point in the stack trace, things like that, and can give you a lot more context than any hand spun solution.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Let's see, I think there's Srini, you have a question?
I was just trying to figure out if I were to run my one DigitalOcean box where I'm paying $5 a month, having Postgres, Nginx, Unicorn running. If I were to go to PaaS, platform as a service, what's the minimum I'm going to pay? And from what I can hear, read on the chat, it says like at least $15 if I need 24/7 uptime. So I don't know. For prototyping, what do you recommend? Like,
so if you're very price sensitive, Heroku has a pretty good free tier. Heroku and Amazon do both have free tiers. Amazon only runs for about a year, whereas Heroku's I think is indefinite, where you can just get up and running on platform as a service with it's not going to be a huge server. You're going to be using I think you get about a gigabyte of RAM on the server. You're not necessarily going to have a huge database, but you can at least get on that and get started with that. And then, if things actually start getting use and you need more bandwidth, then you can, make an assessment about cost. So there are ways to do it for free. If you're talking about, so that's, for kind of personal projects. If you're on just on the company side, like on the enterprise side, yeah, I mean, $50 a month is pretty, you know, is pretty reasonable, or is kind of a pretty normal cost for kind of basic deployment on Amazon. You know, for a load balancer, a server, and a managed database. On the flip side, you know, the question you got to think about is how much effort are you going to be putting into maintaining that server, to building your own database backup system, if you need it, to building your own encryption system, etc. Like, it's, I mean, part of this depends on what you want to take your project and do with it. You know, if this is just going to be a personal use website, and, you know, it's going to be you and some of your friends, and that's really the intended audience, sure, put it on a DigitalOcean server. I've got probably 5 or 6 websites that run on a personal server that you know, not, you know, platform as a service, that, you know, but they're websites that just kind of, you know, are used by me and my wife. If you've got a broader audience in mind, you know, that's a thing to take into account. And if you've got a broader long-term audience in mind, that's a thing to take into account.
Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. Oops, sorry. I interjected in there too early.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I had a question from Robert Paul Chase. Robert?
Hi there. Thank you for taking questions. I have a question. You had mentioned that sometimes it's better to make a website rather than a web app. At what point do you want to use like a content management system and implement like either Django CMS or Mezzanine rather than a website?
All right, so this is kind of often the so this is potentially a different vein from, I mean, if you have a largely content-driven site, the question is going to be, I mean, what's the future of it? If all you're building is, you know, a static marketing site, there's a lot of ways to get that, you know, off the ground. You know, there's like out of the box technologies. I mean, I think even like that can let you build a static website pretty easily. And there's, you know, I mean, setting up a CMS is probably a good approach, or really using a hosted CMS. If what you're going to want to do is plug in a bunch of other functionality to that, that's when you want to start looking at, you know, maybe like Django CMS, or, you know, something like that, and actually doing your own hosting and actually setting that up yourself. But you know, the thing you got to think about is, what's the future of this project? If it will only ever be a marketing website that just displays content, not necessarily worth the effort. If you're going to be building interactive demos and, you know, dynamic customer onboarding components, things like that, you're definitely going to want to be on you know, on infrastructure, you know, something like, you know, something probably Django based, you know, with a real database and real ability for you to inject custom, you know, to actually build out custom workflows.
Thank you.
All right, are there any questions that we have not covered? Or any folks who have questions who you posted into the Zoom chat that I haven't called on yet?
Oh, may I ask one?
Yes, go ahead.
As one. I'm working on a project that's a Django Python 2 app, and it's like 1.6.11 Django. It's
you got to get on Python 3. You got to do it.
No, well, it's so big that it's like I'm kind of just cloning this GitHub project and trying to add on like Okta authentication.
Okay.
So it's like I can't rewrite this. And they're doing Python 3. I already tried that one, but it has a little error, and they're like, it's not ready yet. So they're porting it, but like I'm waiting.
Okay.
So it's Python 2, and I had a lot of trouble trying to find like a Python SAML, like Okta, like library. I finally just started like trying to install all of them around the same time that 1.6.11 came out, until one didn't bug out. But like, should it be as simple as once that's working, just like if they already wrote some sort of authentication, I should be able to just kind of go in there and just kind of like merge it with whatever they already use, because they're probably using Django auth, and I just need to pass in, some SAML request or response information and just auto log in the regular process. Like, does that sound about right? Is that?
So the way that libraries like the library formerly known as Django Social, I don't even remember what it's called. I have to look it up every time. The way they work is that they attach a linked model to the user that keeps track of things like the third party, whatever the third party authentication like ID is for that user, and then they go through the work of doing the SAML or OAuth handshake with the third party authenticator, and then basically are just attached and then say, okay, great, that's passed. We can log the person in as this user. So in theory, yes, if you have found a library that can do this for you, or written your own SAML or OAuth connector, like you can on the back end just invoke log in as a particular user. That's what these libraries are doing. That's how they work. Just the normal workflow in Django is, you go and verify that the user, has the password stored in the database, and then you take that user object and call login on it. So you can basically, as long as you are confident in whatever verification you're doing on that user, yeah, you can just plug that into an existing Django project.
Sweet.
Did that answer the question?
It did. I don't want to take up too much time, but yeah, I mean, I'm just, I'm in the process of weaving that together. I've gotten all the way to my website can link to Okta. The response comes back, and I can see the first name, last name, email, and all I need to do is, they already wrote, like, it's not just as simple as login. Like, they wrote some sort of thing that leverages Django auth and login, that like, there's a couple different kind of like, you have to register and log in. There's like things to become a user. And I'm trying to figure out how to just feed this like email, like right through whatever they already wrote, so that like, once you log in with Okta, even though they have a registration or login page, you don't ever see that anymore. We just like call that functionality on the back end, so that like you never do that anymore. But I'm just trying to sort through that. Yeah,
basically what you want to do is do a get or create on a user, with a particular, with an email and whatnot, and then invoke login on that user. The backend login function, not the whole front end pathway.
Oh, just like go straight through the database, or just like the straight up login functionality?
Yeah, so the Django login says, okay, we're logging in as this user, put that, create a session object, stick that user ID in the session, etc.
Okay.
That's all authentication is, really, is you've got a session with a user ID in it.
I suppose even if they wrote stuff, I don't have to use it. I could just log in, log out.
Yep.
Depending. The only thing I have to just double check is if the app ends up using data from that user, does it have access? Are the models all synced up? Is it really going to be that simple? But anyway, I'll be investigating. Thank you.
And you could potentially plug in something like Django Social to an existing project, and just add that as an authentication backend.
I'll try. They needed Okta specifically, SAML or OpenID, so I can't use like Google. But
sure. I mean, the point of a good authentication library is it has connectors for 100 different things.
So when you integrate Okta, what do you use? Just the social one that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think they have Okta Connect. I believe they have Okta connectors. They definitely do. They've got support for a number of SAML integrations.
All right, I'll check that out. Perfect.
If it's Python 2 compatible. Python 2, dicey these days.
Thank you, Zags. So I just want to check if anybody else has questions. If not, we will wrap up questions. All right. This has been really awesome talk. Thank you, Zags.
Yeah, definitely.
And thank you everyone for the questions. I guess for the folks who had questions, if you're still around, is it okay with you if we post your questions online along with the talk? If it's not okay, you can feel free to DM me and I will edit your question out from the questions. Otherwise, I'll leave them in. But I want to make sure I have your permission first. All right, cool, thank you. And I want to thank you guys, audience. You've been a great audience tonight. Everyone's been, kind of, it's just like Django Boston in person, with everybody is like, really good, and it's like not making a lot of noise in the background and everything. It's just, you guys have been great. Thank you so much. Zags, do you have anything that you wanted to add at the end here?
Yeah, thank you guys for coming, and may your hackathons be fruitful.
Thank you. Ruben, do you have anything?
Nope. Just thanks everyone for coming. Really appreciate it. And this was a great talk, Zags. Thanks so much. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everyone.